Welcome back. Yes, this is the channel on British literature and culture, but nevertheless, I'm going to talk about comics in the following installment. So you're not interested in those, just skip the next videos, all right? But what I'm going to do now is exactly that. Give you an introduction to comic studies, okay? So the question is, predominantly, how are stories told in this narrative genre? But first of all, I would like to start with that here. A brief history of comics, of course, and you all know, comics started out in the 1930s and 40s as action comics, and very quickly, another genre evolved, love romances. So action comics more or less for teenage boys, and love romances, they try to find an equivalent for girls. Okay, those comics depicted stereotypes. Superheroes who behaved exactly the way they did because they were superheroes, or young girls and their lovers, or women and their lovers, who were certainly not people of flesh and blood. Those comics were serialized in those days, which has strong repercussions on their production process because there's pressure of time. Okay, so authors just couldn't sit there and take all the time they needed, but they had to produce another volume every month, say, or something, to be sold at the newsstands. Those comics were colored, in the beginning very crude, coloring only yellow, blue, green, and red, and this got a lot more sophisticated once the technological progress allowed that. A limited number of pages, which means you have to tell a story in something like 48 pages or 32, depending on the kind of comic you have. The audience, they aimed at an audience of white, teen-aged boys and girls. Okay, and white, this is the thing, yes, in the beginning, very much that was the case. And the same is true for the authors who were usually heteronormative white males. Okay, all right. This is the beginning of comics, and all this changed in a way, or did it change? But another genre evolved in the 1960s, which we call underground comics. First of all, underground comics, then later on, the term alternative comics was applied to the same genre. And a lot changed in those days, in the 1960s. You had special target groups, of course, groups who were not, of course, we may call mainstream white, middle-class people, but specific target groups in specialized bookstores. That is important. Authors even started to copy their own comics and sold them there. A comparatively low print run in the beginning, but a lot of underground comics turned mainstream later on. Of course, they did. Not Marvel and DC, the big two publishing companies, but things like Raw. Raw, a comic magazine founded by the great Art Spiegelman and his wife, unfortunately discontinued in the early 1990s. But Drawn and Quarterly is still going strong, a publishing company based in Quebec. And if you managed as an alternative comic author, if you managed to publish with Drawn and Quarterly, you really have made it. But this genre, other than superhero comics, there was no time pressure in the production process because, people, no pressure from the industry. And so you could take time and produce something like what you wanted. And this, of course, the graphic novel emerged from that you may sit there for a year or even longer and produce whatever you like. It's based not as action comics on action, but on plot, on conversation, on people interacting, not so much on action and catching, villains or something like this. And other than those early comics, which are still going on, of course, superhero comics, no stereotypes, but people more or less of flesh and blood. And those comics were, still are, usually not colored, of course, but are kept in black and white, which up to the present day is a sign of quality. We are not interested in creating special effects or some of this. We are telling stories, and we don't need colors for that. And the authors were not heteronormative white males, most of them not. So this is what comics are, yeah? And from this, the graphic novel emerged, which is, of course, one of the greatest narrative genres we have presently. Okay, but let's talk about some definition of comics. And here is the famous Scott McCloud. By the way, here his understanding comics, a comic on comics, still state of the art and still a standard reading. Okay, can only recommend that. But he says comics consist of juxtaposed pictorial and other images in deliberate sequence intended to convey and or produce an authentic response in the viewer. A very, very cumbersome definition of comics. What does he mean by convey or produce authentic response in the viewer and juxtapose pictorial images? It's a bit that. Nevertheless, I mean, great read and highly recommended. Understanding comics. Now, there are other definitions, of course. Here, Duncan and Smith. As an art form, a comic book is a volume in which all aspects of the narrative are represented in pictorial and linguistic images encapsulated in a sequence of juxtaposed panels and pages. We can live with that. What I like about this, that he mentions narrative. They tell a story in images, sequences, and pages, and add to that language. Okay, the definition is that of Will Eisner. Comics are sequential art. Which means art put in sequence, which in a way does that, but does not pay attention to the interplay between words and pictures. Some people, some comic theorists completely deny or completely rebuke any definition of comics. Here, Douglas Walk. I'm not going to define comics here because if you have not been trapped in the last century in a magic lantern, you already know what they are. This is more or less, I'm not going to define those. If you have one in your hand, you know what it is. And this is what Douglas Walk, to his name, says. I would like to propose a very my own definition of comics, which is that here. That comics are a narrative genre, which I think is important because they tell stories. They have to tell a story, and they have to consist of word and pictures. And for me, the important thing is those interact. One cannot do without the other. You have words and pictures, and those two have to go together. If you have only pictures and you can understand the story, then it's not a comic. It's just a picture book. Even if you have a picture book, and that's the definition of picture book for me. If a picture book is something where the pictures tell the stories and or the other way around, and the words tell the stories, but one can do without the other. That's the thing. Comics cannot. They interact, and that for me is the important issue here. But the question is, of course, are pictures able to tell stories at all? And this has been denied, very much so, by this one here. Ibrahim Lessing. Lessing, the great German theorist and poet, some like 250 years ago, he said, if it be true that painting in its imitations makes use of entire different means and signs from those which poetry employs, the former employing figures and color in space, the latter articulates sounds in time. He talks about pictures and poetry and how they are different. And so far, and that brings this down to what he says, pictures exist in space, and words in time, which means texts in time. You have to read one word after the other, and this produces the passage of time. And pictures just depict a place. So yes, for Lessing, who is in a way very much indebted to Aristotle, you see that here, denying that you can tell stories with pictures at all. Okay, but in order to tell stories, you need the passage of time. You need the passage of time because stories exist in time. And comics found the means to do exactly that, to depict the passage of time in pictures and words. And how they do that will be the focus on the following videos. Thank you very much.